Beyond the Gates spoilers tease that on Friday, June 20th, Vanessa McBride will lean heavily into her newly forged alliance with Joey Armstrong, an alliance that seems to straddle the fine line between lucrative enterprise and forbidden pleasure. Ever since their introduction at the city's most exclusive charity gala, rumors have swirled around the pair's dynamic. Her trademark poise and icy determination contrasted sharply with his devil-may-care charm and penchant for risk. Friends and rivals alike have watched Vanessa's approach to Joey shift subtly, her softening demeanor in private juxtaposed against the unyielding steel of her negotiating tactics in the boardroom. That juxtaposition will reach its apex this evening as they meet under the glittering chandeliers of her penthouse loft to finalize a business arrangement that promises to erase Doug McBride's crippling gambling debt and, perhaps just as tantalizingly, to kindle a fire neither can fully control. Vanessa arrives precisely at 8, the city skyline's neon haze filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows behind her. She's dressed in a fitted charcoal sheath that accentuates her sculpted silhouette, hair swept into an elegant chignon that leaves her neck exposed, an unspoken invitation to vulnerability. Yet vulnerability is the last thing Vanessa intends to display. Every inch of her carries the promise of calculated intent. Joey, in contrast, drifts in 5 minutes late, unshaven stubble and rumpled blazer, giving him a rakish air of spontaneity. He flashes that trademark grimboyish, yet no wingas. He hands her a single white rose. He jokes about punctuality and chivalry, but his eyes betray something darker, a man used to having the odds stacked in his favor, now confronted with a woman who could rewrite those odds on a whim. Their conversation begins with business niceties. Joey praises Vanessa's growing real estate portfolio. She counters by acknowledging his marketing prowess. Yet beneath the polished banter, a more dangerous negotiation simmers. Joey knows Vanessa's vulnerabilities, her desperate drive to protect Doug, that fragile pride she keeps fiercely guarded. She, in turn, senses his hunger to prove himself worthy of her trust and perhaps more. When she refers to Doug's gambling debts, her tone shifts imperceptibly from cordial to steel-driven. "You understand," she says, "that Doug gambled our future away. I won't allow it again." Joey nods, offering a draft contract printed on heavy ivory paper, the terms favoring Vanessa in every conceivable way. She retains majority stakes in their joint venture. Joey accepts a capped share of profits, and Doug is absolved of all existing debt in exchange for Joey's exclusive rights to market and brand the properties they co-manage. As Joey leans forward to seal the deal with a handshake, Vanessa catches his wrist, her touch unexpectedly firm. Their eyes lock, and in that charged moment the boundary between corporate allies and secret lovers blurs. Without a word, she tugs him closer. He responds by curling his fingers around her waist. The handshake dissolves into a lingering kiss, pure impulse layered over 1,000 calculated motivations. That kiss, bold enough to shock onlookers and tender enough to betray unspoken longing, becomes the signature stroke on a contract neither party will forget. Behind closed doors, ink dries on pages that bind business and desire as tightly as her arms around his neck. Yet, even as Vanessa basks in the thrill of triumph, a darker current pulls her thoughts back to Joey's underhanded entry into her world. She recalls how he once slyly exploited Doug McBride's gambling addiction to worm his way into the McBride real estate empire, a move that would have torn her family apart if not for her own cunning counterstrike. Doug's shame-fueled silences, Vanessa's late-night strategizing sessions, and the whispered threats passed in dimly lit back rooms all culminated in tonight's spectacle. She is determined not only to protect what she has built, but also to extract a price for Joey's betrayal. As they part ways, Joey vanishing into the city night like a wraith, Vanessa returning to her throne-like office, she plots her next move. A subtle but devastating maneuver that will remind Joey Armstrong that crossing Vanessa McBride is a gamble no one walks away from unscathed. Meanwhile, at the Countryside Club, where polished oak panels meet the scent of aged whiskey, a nameless waiter has quietly taken on a new identity, Kenneth. No longer the benign serving staff of last season's tournaments, he has become an unsettling observer of Vernon Dupree and Martin Richardson, both prominent figures in the local power structure. Kenneth's presence is as inscrutable as his motives. He hovers in shadowed corners, refilling drinks with an almost ritualistic precision, offering polite nods that seem to carry hidden messages. Vernon, upright and self-assured in tailored tweeds, senses Kenneth's watchful gaze each time he convenes with his fellow members. Martin, younger by a generation and endlessly ambitious, has already confided in his grandfather about Kenneth's cryptic insinuations, a whispered reference to that night, a hint at unspeakable involvement in past events that should have remained buried. In a tense confrontation on the terrace overlooking Misty Grounds, Vernon accuses the waiter of meddling in affairs far above his station. Kenneth's expression remains placid, eyes glinting with unspoken knowledge. "I'm merely a humble servant," he says, voice soft and almost melodic, "but I've learned that those who share secrets often find themselves undone." Vernon's flush of anger gives way to cold calculation. He will not permit this shadow to haunt his family's legacy. Later that evening, as Vernon dials an unlisted number in a private study, his words are measured yet laced with threat. "You promised to handle the situation. I want it done by tomorrow night." The stranger on the other end offers reassurance in quiet tones, but Vernon's knuckles whiten around the phone. He may be a man of law and civility, yet he understands that safeguarding his kin sometimes demands more ruthless measures. Back at Richardson Manor, Martin sits in the library with his grandfather, old, ailing, yet still fearsome in intellect. Martin recounts the waiter's eerie rehearsals of his personal history, how Kenneth seemed to recall details of a night Martin had only shared in hushed confidences. The grandfather's eyes narrow beneath heavy brows. "There are gaps in your story, boy," he murmurs, "gaps that someone like Kenneth is more than willing to exploit." Yet no plan is laid bare in that room. Instead, Martin is left with a gnawing dread, awareness that some unseen player now holds the trump cards in their high-stakes game, and that exposure could topple reputations and fortunes alike. Meanwhile, the undercurrent of tension extends beyond the McBrides and Richardsons to a marriage once celebrated as the union of two of the region's most influential families. Nicole Richardson arrives at her estranged husband Ted's office carrying a single manila envelope, its contents unknown, its presence more formidable than any confrontation. Their decades-long relationship has weathered scandals, power struggles, and the secret birth of a child whose very existence threatens to fracture the fragile peace they've maintained. Ted, still sharp despite years of political maneuvering, looks up from his mahogany desk as Nicole stands before him, expression a mixture of resolve and sorrow. He rises to greet her, but the warmth once so natural between them has cooled into polite formality. Nicole places the envelope on the desk with deliberate care. Her voice trembles just enough to betray the gravity of her news. "I need you to review these. You promised you'd support Methra if anything." Ted's fingers brush the edge of the envelope. He feels its weight, heavier than any briefcase he's carried. Inside could be divorce papers, proof of infidelity, or perhaps the sealed record of their child's paternity. Nicole's earlier suggestion that she wanted to sell Fairmont Gates, the sprawling estate that once symbolized their unity, now echoes ominously. Ted's mind races through the implications: financial exposure, public humiliation, loss of a legacy he's nurtured for decades. Yet beneath his practiced calm, a flicker of paternal concern surfaces. His eyes meet Nicole's, pleading silently for mercy even as he steels himself for whatever revelation awaits. As Nicole whispers, "I had to do this," the tension between them crackles like electricity. There is no easy resolution in sight, just two partners bound by duty, desire, and a shared history now threatening to collapse under the weight of unspoken truths. The envelope remains unopened, a silent testament to the perilous crossroads at which they stand. Across town, In a penthouse high above the city's pulse, Vanessa drafts her counterproposal to Joey's earlier agreement. Her midnight blue dress pools around her like spilled ink as she pores over spreadsheets and redlines clauses with surgical precision. Every adjustment is a dagger aimed at Joey's ambitions, a clause that triggers immediate buyout if he fails to meet performance metrics, an exclusivity term that prevents him from collaborating with rival developers, and a confidentiality agreement enforceable by crippling penalties. She knows that once Joey signs, he will be locked in, and so will she. But Vanessa hungers for leverage. She wants the guaranteed path to revenge for his old betrayal. And if he pushes back, she'll remind him of the kiss that sealed their deal, proof that he once craved her equally, and that the power between them is anything but one-sided. By dawn, Vanessa stands on her terrace inhaling the cool air, the contract clutched in her hand like a talisman. She recalls Doug's tear-streaked face when she told him she'd saved him from ruin, yet would no longer tolerate weakness. He had gazed at her with a mixture of awe and fear, ashamed of his failures, yet forever grateful for her unwavering fortress of strength. In that moment, Vanessa realizes that her own fortress may have vulnerabilities she can no longer ignore. The coming collision with Joey will test not only her business acumen, but the darkest recesses of her heart, vengeance or forgiveness, domination or surrender. And as the first rays of sunlight slice across the skyline, she makes her choice, to wield her power without remorse, and to ensure that anyone who wrongs Vanessa McBride learns that beyond the gates of her world lies a realm of reckoning. Thus unfolds the opening act of the tangled saga at Beyond the Gates, alliances formed in pleasure and peril, secrets poised to shatter legacies, and the first tremors of reckoning that will shake every life bound by ambition, loyalty, and the haunting promise of retribution. Joey's phone buzzed twice before he dared glance at the screen. The digital clock beside his bed glowed 2:17 a.m., each minute ticking like a metronome of dread. He had returned to his downtown loft clutching Vanessa's redlined contract, her terms carved with the precision of a scalpel. Every clause was designed to pin him down, to turn what had begun as equal partnership into a cage of obligations. Yet as he stared at the word performance triggers, exclusivity covenants, penalty schedules, she could almost taste the adrenaline that first charged him when Vanessa had pressed that contract into his hand with a kiss. He remembered the pulse of her lips against his, as though sealing more than paper and ink. Now, in the quiet darkness of his apartment, that same kiss felt like the last intoxicating breath before a storm. He read the first clause aloud. Failure to meet quarterly marketing benchmarks shall result in immediate buyout option exercisable by McBride Real Estate. He whispered Vanessa's name, as though invoking her would transform that sentence from a threat into a promise of shared triumph. But he knew her too well. Vanessa thrived on leverage. Their union of pleasure and business was as fragile as a soap bubble, brilliant in its colors of opportunity, but poised to shatter at the slightest pressure. He felt his heart racing, caught between fear of losing his stake and the thrill that only Vanessa McBride could ignite. Swallowing the lump in his throat, he tapped out a message, "Let's meet tomorrow. I have ideas." Then he dropped the phone onto the nightstand and closed his eyes, wrestling sleep from his restless mind. At Richardson Manor, a storm of a different nature was brewing. On the terrace behind the grand estate, Vernon Dupree stared out at the rolling hills, phone pressed to his ear. The voice on the other end was calm, inscrutable, but the message was clear. Kenneth, the man he'd branded a meddler, would be dealt with swiftly. Vernon's jaw clenched as he contemplated the weight of what he had authorized. He was a man of law and decorum, yet he understood that in their world, power was maintained through both contracts and the quiet threat of consequences. He hung up and sighed, the cool night air failing to soothe his mounting unease. Kenneth had too much knowledge, too much potential to expose the skeletons of both the Dupree and Richardson families. Tonight, Vernon would send his own operative a discreet repeal of Kenneth's influence, a silent expulsion from the club's velvet shadows. Inside the Manor's library, Martin Richardson stood before the fireplace, its embers casting flickering patterns against his tense features. He held in his hand the leather-bound journal his grandfather had entrusted to him, its pages filled with cryptic entries about that night. Martin's mind replayed Kenneth's every ply, the waiter's uncanny awareness of private conversations, his subtle mentions of events Martin had only described in confidence to one other person. Every time Martin had laughed it off as coincidence, Kenneth's eyes had glinted with something akin to pity. Now, Martin felt rage better than fear. If the Duprees thought they could eliminate this threat by brute force, he would have to act faster, smarter. He tucked the journal into his jacket pocket and strode toward the club, determination setting his shoulders in a straight line. Nicole Richardson lay awake in the suburban guest house behind her former marital home, the envelope still unopened on the bedside table. Ted and she had parted on strained but civil terms, but Nicole sensed that civility was evaporating faster than morning dew. The papers inside could sever ties forever. Divorce decrees, custody agreements, or most dangerously, the documents to sell Fairmont Gates her beloved family estate. She rose, illuminating the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside lay a single sheet, a letter from Leslie Thomas, their mutual friend and inside observer, revealing the details of Vanessa's deal with Joey Armstrong and naming Ted as a potential purchaser of the McBride properties should Joey default. The knowledge that her ex-husband might stake a claim on what was once their shared dream felt like salt rubbed into old wounds. Nicole folded the letter closed and tucked it into her purse. Tomorrow, she would confront Ted and Leslie Thomas demanding explanations, seeking to wrest control of her own fate. By the time dawn began to leak its pale light across the horizon, the stage was set for confrontations both subtle and explosive. Joey arrived at Vanessa's penthouse shortly after 8, carrying a battered leather portfolio and an air of cautious optimism. Vanessa greeted him at the door, the high collar of her ivory blouse framing her expression like a mask. She stepped aside, and he passed into the living room, heart pounding as he laid the thick packet of fresh proposals atop her marble coffee table. Outside, downtown traffic hummed below the city's heartbeat that had once lulled him to dreams of fortune. Now, it underscored the fact that nothing would ever be simple again. "I've reworked the projections," Joey began, smoothing his palms before him. "Instead of locking us both in with penalties, let's consider a revenue-sharing model tied to performance milestones." He outlined scenarios where each party earned more as the portfolio grew, rather than punishing failure. Vanessa listened, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. From the corner of her eye, he watched her breath catch when he mentioned the possibility of expanding into luxury hospitality, a joint venture that could triple earnings, but also test their fragile trust. She interrupted him gently. "I'm listening," she said, and the words felt like both an invitation and a warning. He pressed on, describing how Doug's experience in event management could bolster their brand, how strategic alliances with local investors might offset upfront costs. Each suggestion came with the caveat that he would accept the exclusivity she insisted upon, but only if she agreed to a clawback clause that protected his stake in the case of early termination. They leaned closer across the coffee table, voices low but fervent, as the city slowly awakened beneath them. For a moment, hope simmered between them, not the reckless infatuation of their first kiss, but the sober excitement of two minds converging on mutual profit. Yet before they could finalize anything, Vanessa's phone buzzed. She frowned, reading the message, and her calm facade flickered. "I'm sorry," she said, closing her eyes. "I have to take this." She strode to the window, picking up the device. Joey watched as her face hardened. After a tense minute, she returned. "That was Vernon Dupree. He's at the club. Apparently Kenneth was found drunk and disorderly after hours. They're talking about expelling him." Her lips curved into a small, grim smile. "Would you believe he actually admitted to fabricating stories about the Richardsons?" A waiter turned provocateur confessed under questioning. Joey raised an eyebrow, concern mingling with curiosity. But why involve me? Vanessa's answer was a whisper, because Kenneth hinted that he knew about our arrangement. He's been snooping around my offices. She turned sharply to Joey. I need you to be ready for anything. At the Countryside Club, Vernon and his aide-de-camp, a lean former detective named Harris, confronted Kenneth in the members' lounge. Kenneth sat calmly, as though expecting this moment. The aide-de-camp flicked open a phone, playing audio of Kenneth's own voice admitting to creating false narrative and undercover recording made by Martin Richardson at Vernon's behest. Kenneth's eyes widened, then narrowed. Do you think this destroys me? He asked, voice surprisingly composed. Vernon nodded, satisfaction flickering in his eyes. Yet as they turned to leave, Kenneth's calm voice stopped them. You may have me removed, he said, but you'll never know who else I've spoken to or where I planted seeds of doubt. His hand moved inside his jacket, and both men stiffened, expecting a weapon. Instead, he produced a small flash drive. I'd advise you to handle the files on here with caution. Every scandal, every secret in the Richardson and Dupree archives unearthed and ready to go public. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Vernon's aide-de-camp snatched the drive, but Vernon signaled him to stand down. You'll leave, Vernon said quietly. And you'll never return. If you ever speak of this, I will see that everything on that drive is exposed. Kenneth inclined his head, straightening his tie. He stood, indifferent to humiliation, and walked away with the grace of someone who had already won. Back at the manor, Martin Richardson listened from the shadows as Vernon's car screamed away down the drive. When the dust settled, he slipped inside and confronted his grandfather in the dimly lit drawing room. He still has leverage, Martin said, voice taut with urgency. Kenneth wasn't bluffing. The older man closed his eyes, leaning heavily on his cane. Then we will have to change the game entirely, he rasped. Selective disclosure. Time to remind Kenneth that secrets are weapons best held by those who can control their release. Together, grandfather and grandson plotted a counterstrike, leaking a carefully curated dossier to a trusted reporter, framing Kenneth as an opportunistic mercenary rather than a victim, thereby undermining his credibility. Martin felt the familiar adrenaline of strategic warfare, and his grandfather, locked in a dance older than either family's rise to prominence. Meanwhile, Nicole Richardson stormed into Ted's office downtown, the envelope clutched in her fist like a grenade. Ted looked up from his paperwork, surprise flashing across his face before composure settled back. Nicole slammed the envelope onto his desk. Leslie Thomas knows everything. She's offering to broker a deal between Vanessa and me if you agree to step aside on the property sale. Ted's hand hovered above the documents. Nicole, let's talk calmly, she cut him off. Calmly? You sold the estate without telling me, didn't you? You brokered a contingency with that Armstrong fellow, didn't you? Her voice trembled. Ted sighed, lowering himself into a chair. I only did what I thought best for our family. Vanessa's network is vast. She could make Fairmont Gates more profitable than ever. Nicole shook her head. Or she could erase everything we built in one deal. Her eyes were hard. I'm not your child anymore, Ted. I make my own decisions. She stood and backed toward the door. But if you cross me, I'll leak the custody documents to every lawyer in town. Then she was gone, leaving Ted staring at the envelope, torn between paternal instinct and the cold calculus of power. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the city, the players moved into position for the next round. Joey drafted a counterproposal to Vanessa's revisions, a handshake clause, a dispute resolution mechanism, and a promise that failure would mean renegotiation, not annihilation. Vanessa read it late into the night, her expression inscrutable. Each clause he offered was an olive branch wrapped in barbed wire, something she appreciated, even as she calculated how to turn it into leverage. Meanwhile, Vernon Dupree issued a discreet ban on Kenneth, severing his access cards and sending notices to every club across the region. Martin Richardson released the first tranche of selective leaks, framing Kenneth as a disgruntled ex-employee rather than a whistleblower. Leslie Thomas prepared her role as mediator, planning to host a clandestine dinner where Vanessa and Nicole might find common ground or at least pin each other with unspoken compromises. In the silence before midnight, Doug McBride awoke to an empty apartment, a single text message blinking on his screen. Everything's being handled. Sleep. He closed his eyes, haunted by the memory of Vanessa's steely gaze when she promised to save him, yet never hinted at the price she might exact later. Guilt and relief warred within him, owed her everything, yet feared the debt he could never truly repay. High above the city, in her penthouse sanctuary, Vanessa poured herself a glass of single malt scotch. She swirled the amber liquid, watching it catch the faint glow of the skyline. The contract lay open on the glass table beside her, Joey's handwriting scrawled in the margins, challenging her terms. She sipped, tasting both the warmth of triumph and the bitterness of a war just beginning. She thought of Doug's silent tears, Martin's cunning mind, Vernon's menacing calm, Nicole's fierce resolve, and Leslie's poised neutrality. Into this tapestry of power plays, she had inserted herself, and now she would write the next chapter in blood and gold. Tomorrow, she would send Joey her counter proposal, and the dance would continue. Alliances would shift, secrets would leak like poison, and only those who mastered the art of both pleasure and pain would emerge unscathed from the realm beyond her gates.